Well, in the last lesson, we took a look at places like England or places like those American colonies during the days of the Great Awakening. And hopefully, you got an idea of the condition of these places. Hopefully, you have a notion of how desperately in need of the gospel message they were. You have England, who really was kind of trapped by liberalism, was really trapped by just doing whatever they wanted to do. And then you had the American colonies was really trapped by conservatism, that was really trapped by trying to obey the law and trying to be very moral, but had no concept of the notion of grace in the first place. And so because you have that contrast, because you have that reality, it really opened up the opportunity for the Great Awakening. It's one thing to keep in mind. Whenever you're looking at a culture, whether it be our culture or a culture of the past or wondering what the future culture is going to be like, no matter how dark it looks, you always have to recognize that it always means an opportunity for the gospel itself. It always means an opportunity for God's holiness to actually conquer, because it always conquers. Now, today we're going to take a look at three men. The first was Theodor Frelinghuysen. And that's just a fun name to say. In fact, you go ahead and say it to yourself, Frelinghuysen, if you like. But you also need to note it. That's a Dutch name. His family came from the Netherlands and so forth. They were a part of that Dutch Reformed community that was over here in the area of New York or New Jersey. Now, to give you an idea of when he lived, I'll give you his dates. He lived from 1692 to 1747. And he himself was a pastor. And he was a pastor in the area of New Jersey. Specifically, he was pastoring in a valley known as the Raritan Valley. And in this region of the country, he began to actually to do something that was quite different. In fact, let me read you a quote about Frelinghuysen, about his preaching. This was by John McNeill. John McNeill said this about Frelinghuysen. He said, Frelinghuysen preached with evangelical passion. He called his hearers to repentance and renewal of life, charged his colleagues in the ministry with being unconverted. He warned the ill-disciplined and careless from the Lord's Supper and pronounced damnation upon hardened sinners. In other words, what made Frelinghuysen incredible was not the fact that he somehow just said nice things. It was the fact that he actually confronted people over issues of sin, and he did it with passion that showed that he actually cared about them personally and cared about where they were going. Now, the revival that becomes the Great Awakening begins with Frelinghuysen in the year 1719. It was in that year, in the Raritan Valley, that he began to preach, and people suddenly had incredible conversions. People showed incredible interest in things of eternity. People showed incredible interest in what the Scriptures actually had to say. And what's interesting is that even though these messages were happening often in the countryside, where things are sometimes seen as simple, and even though the message was simple itself, as the historian Paul Johnson says, this message and this movement was not simplistic. What that means is that these people were very serious about Christianity, they were very serious about ideas, and they were very serious about how they lived out those ideas. And so it was anything but simple. In fact, that's one of the hallmarks you see is that the Great Awakening produced an incredible amount of schools. Not just common schools that taught you how to read, although it did do that, but also incredible universities. Both Princeton and Dartmouth, for example, and even Columbia University or Penn University, some of the most noted schools in our nation today, all of those had roots connected to or directly out of the Great Awakening. In fact, Penn University was founded by friends of George Whitefield, and it's hard to imagine that ever would have been founded had it not been for the Great Awakening and the work of a man like George Whitefield. Well, what Frelinghuysen did, and the last thing I want you to note about him, was Frelinghuysen really emphasized the Scriptures. He saw it as a very plain idea. Not only do you have to teach people the gospel message and actually explain what the Scriptures mean to them, but you need to encourage them to read it for themselves. And so he was quite willing to tell people what Scriptures meant, but he always encouraged them to take it home and to actually build upon it individually and also as families, as communities, as churches, and so forth. And so the gospel really begins, or the Great Awakening really begins in the American colonies through that simple reading of the Scriptures itself. Now, the second man we're going to take a look at for this lesson was a man by the name of William Tennent. And William, along with his son Gilbert, are a famous pair from the Great Awakening. To give you an idea of when he lived, William Tennant's dates are 1673 to 1745. So you see that these guys are coming in that era, that generation leading up to the 1776 era. But William Tennant came from a Scotch-Irish background. He himself was a pastor, and he lived in Pennsylvania, in a little town called Neshaminy. You can go ahead and note that as well. Well, William Tennant had the single idea. He had the single idea that the scriptures needed to be taught alongside of the classics of Western civilization, of the classics of Greek thought, the classics of Roman poetry, the classics of the medieval era, the classics of the Renaissance, the Reformation. In other words, the scriptures were essentially the great classic. They were what provided the key and the whole world of understanding for you to move on to other classics and actually have a wisdom you could take and apply. And so what Tennant did most famously, besides pastoring, besides evangelism and leading people to the gospel, was he founded a famous school known simply as the Log College. And this Log College did what I just told you. It taught the scriptures and it taught the classics. And it was a very serious school. You had to know original languages, things like Latin and Greek and Hebrew, in order to actually understand these classics in the first place or read them in their original languages. Not only that, but this Log College became a prototype. It became a model for other schools throughout the nation, particularly the College of New Jersey, which today we simply know as Princeton. Either way, though, between William Tennant and his son Gilbert, who became the pastor of a great parish church in Philadelphia, both of these men had an incredible mark on the Great Awakening. Now, the third man is a man you might have heard of before. He's rather famous throughout all of American history, and that is, of course, Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards had a brilliant mind. In fact, Benjamin Franklin said that he was the greatest intellectual that America had produced. And in fact, he might very well have been. The only one I can even think of that's close to him is Cotton Mather, who also was quite prodigious in how many books he wrote and on how many subjects he actually mastered. But this is quite a compliment coming from a man like Benjamin Franklin, who himself wrote much and who himself had an incredible understanding of the way the world was made in lots of different subjects. It's one of the incredible things about these men. Now, Edwards, his dates, to give you an idea, he lived from 1703 to 1758. And he came from Connecticut, but he was quite an incredible student as a young person. And like Cotton Mather, he entered university, this case was Yale, at the age of 12. Now, perhaps what's even more incredible is not just the fact that he entered university so early on. What's perhaps most incredible is that he graduated first in his class just a few years later, but when he graduated first in his class, he had already written papers on everything from how the brain works, to spiders, to atomic theory, to theology, to philosophy. In other words, he's what we call a polymath, which is really what Benjamin Franklin was, it's what Thomas Jefferson was, it was what Cotton Mather was. And a polymath is someone who has a mastery over lots of different disciplines, over lots of different subjects. And we usually, in this modern era, think, oh, you're really good at history, or you're really good at English, or you're really good at math, or science, or art, or whatever it may be. But these men were not content to think that way. The way these men thought about disciplines or thought about these subjects was they thought about them as different languages that God had made for the world. And so therefore, if you understood the nature of God and the nature of man in this world, you could also begin to understand those various subjects. So these men weren't content to say, oh, I'm not a math person, and just write it off. No, they would pursue it until they had mastered it, even if it took them years and years and years, as it sometimes takes you and I. Well, by the age of 21, Jonathan Edwards had become the head tutor at Yale, which pretty much put him in charge of the entire school. Yale, kind of like Oxford and Cambridge today, had a system where you didn't really so much go to classes with teachers. You would attend lectures, but you had a tutor, an individual person who mentored you. And Edwards was the head of all of those tutors. Eventually, he moved on from the realm of education, and he became the pastor at the church in Northampton, Massachusetts. In fact, this was a church that his grandfather had pastored years before, and Edwards would be there for 20 years himself. As a a sermon giver, as someone who preached the scriptures, Edwards himself was well known for giving very finely crafted sermons. In fact, his sermons were often very complex. Sometimes they had as many as 42 points to them. And these sermons, which often called people to think seriously about things like sin, to think seriously about things like hell, always at the same time had an incredible joy underlying them. Because Edwards was able to point out two things in all of his sermons. He was able to point out God's holiness, and he was able to point out God's beauty. For example, let me read to you a simple quote about Edwards and his ability to preach. He said this, "The glorious excellencies and the beauty of God is the greatest of earthly pleasures, as well as spiritual transformation. Through God, we love beauty, and our joy in beauty is worship." In other words, Edwards, as much as he talks about sin, as much as he's known for these sermons that are sometimes very convicting, there's always joy behind it. As a result, his sermons really started the Great Awakening. They really began, as Edward notes in his journal, to cause people to think about very serious eternal matters. As a result, Edward's sermons became the foundation of so many conversions, which is incredible because people would cry in his sermons, people would run to the altar even though he didn't often call them to the altar. And what's incredible is that Edwards always read his sermons. He didn't rely upon a voice that went up in pitch or that went down in pitch or he didn't use hand gestures like I do. He just sat there and he just read them word by word without even changing the inflection of his voice very much. It was the content. It was the actual scriptures. And not only that, it was the culture ready for the gospel that made Edwards so effective. Now, before we move on and end this lesson, I want to note a few more things about Edwards, and primarily, I want you to know a little bit about his most famous sermon, which is a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It was delivered in the year 1741. And like the title notes, this is not exactly a sermon that you read to feel happy or to suddenly give you some kind of cheer after a really bad day. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is a very convicting sermon. It's what we call a fire and brimstone sermon. And the reason is that Edwards gave this sermon at a church that he was not the pastor of. He was actually invited in because this church had been resisting the Great Awakening because the majority of people at this place believed that they were already okay. They believed they were already saved because they thought of themselves as good people. So Edwards comes in there, and he used a verse from Deuteronomy 32, which is, "In due time their feet will slip." And essentially what Edwards pointed out to them is that the fact that God allows you to live, the fact that God allows any of the things in the world to occur, or even evil things in the world to happen, is simply because He wants to. It's a part of His master plan. We don't know why He allows some things and doesn't do other things. All we do know is that God has a master plan, and all those things work together for good. But what Edwards pointed out was he said that when we assume that we have life before us, when we assume that we're going to have breath tomorrow, we're making a mistake. Because in reality, we are like spiders hanging from a single thread over a fire, and that thread can snap at any moment. Now, as incredible as this warning was, at the very end of the sermon, Edwards makes it very plain that Christ has thrown the door wide open for us to come directly to the Father and to take away all fear of actual punishment at the end of time. As a result, this was one of those sermons that really strengthened the Great Awakening and caused so many people to come into the gospel, so many people to come into the kingdom and begin to think, how can we actually change the way that we live? Edwards himself would preach for 20 years, as I mentioned, at his church, although his own church would eventually kick him out of the pulpit because they saw him as too emotional. After that, he went and he preached to the natives of the areas around Massachusetts. He eventually became the president of Princeton, and as an innovator, he actually died because he let his own body be used as a test for a new smallpox vaccine. That little last detail is essential in understanding the Great Awakening. These believers, it wasn't enough for them to just say, oh, here's the truth, think about it. They also had to live it. And so when Edwards saw, here's an opportunity to get rid of smallpox, here's an opportunity to get rid of death, he was quite willing to test it out on his own body. It actually killed him, but Edward's left behind an incredibly rich legacy for us.